I think we'll survive it. And what I first want to say about what we're going to do today and for the next 4 weeks is I want to invest time in you. And the reason why I say I want to invest time in you, because I recognize that a long life's journey, as women, we can have some struggles and we can have some challenges. We can go through some things that sometimes make us feel like we're isolated and no one understands what we're going through. And when we look at how we engage in relationships when it comes to men, how we allow things to take place, sometimes we just need some pearls of wisdom to get us along so that we're not always experiencing what I call a bought lesson, but we're putting ourselves in a position today that we can have a taught lesson so that we might be able to avoid some of those pitfalls. And let's go to the next slide. So today, as we already know, we're going to be talking about letting go of Mr. Wrong, preparing for Mr. Right. And it's all under the umbrella of Queens and the Quicksand. And what I recognize is there are times when we're challenged and we need support and we need encouragement and we need help. And one of the things that I really wanted to preface for this series that we'll do throughout this month is that we're here to encourage one another and support one another. We're here for providing compassion, empathy, and sympathy. But we're not in a space where we want to be judgmental. There may be some things that will be said that may feel somewhat uncomfortable because it hits a very sensitive spot in terms of what's going on in our lives. But I assure you, it is not anything that is intentionally being said to devalue, degrade, or demean you or your situation. But again, I'm here to invest in you and to help you along this life's journey, hopefully providing you with some knowledge and some tools that will help you to navigate through the various situations that you find yourself in. So with that being said, we're going to get into the thrust of this whole lesson for today, or this presentation. So if we can move on, we'll talk about the next. So here we go. This may be a little uncomfortable. So it says, be honest enough to distinguish between what you allow and what was unavoidable. When you do so, you may find you are not a victim of circumstances, but a volunteer in your situation. To me, this becomes one of those comments that we have to be ready to hear it, because it is a comment about ownership. It's a comment about responsibility, and it's a comment about holding yourself accountable. Sometimes when we get into situations, it's more easier, it's more comfortable to find fault in other people, to point the finger at other people and relinquish ourselves from any responsibility in what has taken place in that situation. However, what I want us to consider in this situation and any situation that we go through, we always have to take that moment and say, is it me? And it may not be 100% me, but it may be a situation where we do need to hold ourselves accountable as a contributor to the situation. So with that being said, I want you to keep that in mind as we go along. So it says, who is Mr. Wrong? So if I pose that question, who is Mr. Wrong? I know we're looking at this slide, and for some people, there may be some Lord have mercy fine men on here. There may be some men that you think are mediocre, and there may be some men on this slide that you think are not attractive at all. It just depends on what your taste is. But what I wanted to make known to you is that Mr. Wrong is non-descriptive. And when I say he's non-descriptive, What I'm saying to you is he can be attractive, he can be unattractive. He doesn't have a physical description. So while we look at some of these men on this slide and we think, oh, that couldn't be Mr. Wrong because he's just too attractive, we have to recognize that Mr. Wrong is non-descriptive. There is no physical description for Mr. Wrong. Mr. Wrong comes in various shapes and sizes and in different packaging. And that means even to the tune of someone who's very attractive. And on the other side of that spectrum, Mr. Wrong is not necessarily that person who's unattractive or that person who is mediocre. So we have to consider those things as well. So who is Mr. Wrong? How do we define Mr. Wrong? What does he look like? One of the things that I recognize for Mr. Wrong is Mr. Wrong is cunning. Mr. Wrong is shrewd. Mr. Wrong is observant, very observant. Mr. Wrong is very observant. That's why he's able to connect with some of us, because he's very observant. So what we have to recognize is we can't combat Mr. Wrong if we don't know who he is. We can't combat Mr. Wrong if we don't know what he looks like. We can't combat Mr. Wrong if we don't have some idea of how he operates. So I think it is important, while we want to talk a little bit about Mr. Wrong, we don't want to completely immerse ourselves in Mr. Wrong, because at the end of the day, we can't control him, nor can we change him. The only person that we can control and the only person that we can change is self. But we want to know who Mr. Wrong is so that we can avoid him. So I hope that makes sense when we say, who is Mr. Wrong? So let's go to the next screen. You have to keep clicking. So the question is, how did Mr. Wrong get here? Let's look at the next bullet point. How did he get here? Mr. Wrong sometimes appears in our lives out of fear. We allow this. Remember, some things we allow, we give permission. So let's talk about the fear. What's the fear? How did Mr. Wrong get here? It was fear. What kind of fear are we talking about when we say he got here and it was fear? We're talking about the fear that sometimes women experience, being afraid to be alone. I don't want to be alone. So because I was afraid of being alone, I allowed Mr. Wrong into my space. I allowed him to come into my life. I was afraid that I was going to be alone. There's another type of fear that sometimes we may not consider. Mr. Wrong ends up in our space because of situations where there may have been physical violence or domestic violence. It was something that happened at the beginning of the relationship. We kind of blew it off. We thought it would go away. We didn't think it was going to escalate. And now, after a period of time being in that relationship, we recognize that he is that person. And because of the fear we have of leaving, the fear we have of walking away, the fear of consequences, we stay. And because of that fear, we've allowed Mr. Wrong into a space that he never had any right to be in. So that's the fear part of how Mr. Wrong got here. The other part we talk about is desperation. And I know that's an uncomfortable word. We don't like that. That can make us feel some kind of way. You know, you're saying I'm desperate. Well, here's what I'm talking about. When I say, how did Mr. Wrong get here? And part of that was desperation. The desperation comes from things that we have allowed other women and society to fill us with, or to fill our thoughts with. And the desperation is, I'm getting older. My biological clock is ticking. All my other friends have a man. They're either married or they're in a relationship. So those type of things can motivate, and I don't even want to use the word motivate, but can cause us to feel like you know, it's a matter of time. We have to make this happen. There has to be a man. I have to be in a relationship. You know, like I said, I'm getting older. My biological clock is ticking. I don't want to be by myself, and all my friends are in relationships. They're married, you know, they have a man. But when you know who you are, it's okay that you're alone, because it doesn't mean that you're lonely. It just means you're not in a relationship. And just because you're not in a relationship, that is not something that defines you. But again, I think that society feeds that idea that if you're alone, if your status is single, there must be something wrong with you, when in fact, there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with allowing yourself to be in a space where you're able to make choices. Desperation says, I just want a man. Desperation says, you know, girl, I can change him once we get into the relationship. He'll get better. He won't always be this way. He's just going through something. Desperation will dictate that type of attitude. There's a couple of other things under this same umbrella of how did he get here. So let's look at a couple of other things that come up after desperation. Situational. Sometimes Mr. Wrong got here because it was situational. What am I talking about when I say situational? When I say situational, sometimes Mr. Wrong is showing up because I'm a single mom and I think it's good for my child to have a man in his life. We don't consider what kind of man. We just consider that there needs to be a man. So I'll take Mr. Wrong because I'm a single parent and I want my child to have a man in his life. That's situational. What's another situational? It's on the other end of that spectrum, but it still has to do with the family unit or the family dynamic. Sometimes we will allow Mr. Wrong to reside in our space because we have a child or children by him. And again, we fantasize and romanticize the relationship because it seems like that's the right thing, that, you know, my child or my children should be with their dad. And, you know, we're going to have a house and a 2-car garage and a white picket fence, and we're going to live happily ever after. And so I'm okay with Mr. Wrong being in the picture because he's the dad, he's the father of my children. And yet what happens is we don't weigh out the consequences of that situation. Because if it's Mr. Wrong, the situation is not going to be right just because it's the father of the children. If this person does not treat you right, if this person does not talk to you right, then having him in the picture to complete this romanticized idea of a family unit is not going to be healthy for anybody. And you're going to find yourself under a miserable situation or in a miserable situation that you're going to stay longer than you planned and give more than you ever intended to give, just for the basis of children. One thing that I can't impress upon you enough: children are never going to be strong enough for you to build a relationship on, whether it's the actual father or it's just a man coming into the picture, supposedly taking on the father role. You cannot build a relationship on the shoulders of children. That's very unfair to those children. So if Mr. Wrong is the father of your children, you don't need to try and make that relationship happen, despite knowing that this is a man who does not treat you right, he does not talk to you right, because at that point there's no real value in the relationship and it's all smoke and mirrors. Let's move on. We're still talking about how did Mr. Wrong get here. When we talk about how did Mr. Wrong get here, here's the part where we got to start doing some ownership and some assessment and self-evaluation. Sometimes Mr. Wrong got here because of our lack of self-esteem, our sense of self. We don't have a sense of who we are. And when we don't have a sense of who we are, we will easily allow someone to define us. We will easily allow Mr. Wrong to define who we are because we don't have the self-esteem. We don't have a sense of who we are. And subsequently, we feed into the negativity that Mr. Wrong gives us. The next bullet point, when we talk about lack of, what are we lacking? Why is he here? Self-love. This is so important. Self-love. We have to love ourselves, because when we love ourselves, there are things we will not allow. And I'm going to pull this back just a little further. Not just self-love, you have to like yourself. You'd be surprised how many people don't even like themselves. And if you don't like yourself, then you've got to go from learning how to like yourself to learning how to love yourself. And with that, you're able to start creating boundaries in terms of what you will allow and who you will allow into your life. What's that next bullet point? Self-respect. Ties into love. Because if I love myself, I'm going to respect myself. And if I love and respect myself, there are going to be some things required of other people in order for them to be in my space. So it really lends itself to, how did Mr. Wrong get here? Well, if I don't love myself, if I don't respect myself, if I have low self-esteem, I'm a breeding ground for Mr. Wrong. And remember what I said, he's observant, he's shrewd, he's cunning. He takes enough time to know who the real prey is. And anytime he can see a woman who does not feel good about herself, she lacks self-esteem, she doesn't love herself, she doesn't respect herself, oh, he's about to have a good time. He's about to have a good time because he sees all of the missing attributes that would allow you to shut him down. And what's that last bullet point that we want to talk about? Confidence. It's so important for us to have self-confidence. We have to be confident in ourselves. If you don't have confidence in you, how can you expect someone else to have confidence in you? The equation doesn't make sense. You can't expect someone to have confidence in you when you don't have confidence in yourself. A measure of faith in one's abilities. I have to have a level or a measure of faith in my abilities. Going back to the who am I, knowing who I am, knowing what I can do, knowing what I'm good at, knowing my value. I have to have that, because without that, again, I'm opening up that door for Mr. Wrong to just walk right in and take a seat at the table. One of the things I want us to understand when we talk about how did he get here is that when we can improve on these things, when we can become strong in these areas, what we do is we make that gap smaller and smaller and smaller, where Mr. Wrong is not going to have too many women he can go to. And that's why on one of the descriptions about this, I was talking about strengthening the sisterhood. And I mean that when we talk about strengthening the sisterhood, when I understand what it is to understand my value and who I am, and I can eliminate this lack of, that I'm lessening the playing field for Mr. Wrong. If you can do that same thing, you're lessening the playing field for Mr. Wrong. If we have a sisterhood where we support one another and we say, girl, look, you got to pull it together. You can't allow this to happen to you. You can't allow this to be spoken to you. As we do that, that gap for Mr. Wrong, it gets really small. And he starts to realize, wow, these women are shutting me down. But until we have that type of sisterhood where we can support one another, encourage one another, and be able to have that real talk, because this is real talk stuff. Again, it's back to the ownership, and yeah, I'm guilty of that. And yeah, I need to get better in that arena. So as those things begin to happen and we begin to encourage one another, we begin to support one another, Mr. Wrong is going to have a much more difficult time getting into anybody's space and putting his feet up under anybody's table. Let's move on. So we've talked about those things that help us understand Mr. Wrong and how he got there. So we got to spend a moment talking about exit left for Mr. Wrong, because undoubtedly that's what this really comes down to, understanding that Mr. Wrong must exit. How do we do that? We have to change our perspective and perception. We have to change the way we see the situation. We have to change the narrative, because if we're honest, some of this comes into play when our perception is it'll change, he'll change, it'll get better. He's just going through something for a moment. I know he doesn't have a job, but he's just between jobs right now, and I know he doesn't have a car, and he doesn't have money, and I know, and we know all these things, and we want to give him the benefit of the doubt, and we want to give people the opportunity to change. None of those things are wrong within reason. But there are some things that we recognize that are not going to change. There are some people that we recognize are not going to change. And for that reason, we have to change our perspective and our perception about that situation and about that person. Because as long as we look at that as pie in the sky, and we say things like, it's not that bad, he's not that bad, girl, I think if we get married, it'll change, he'll be better. We say all the things to make us feel comfortable in a dysfunctional situation. So much so until we've allowed the situation, or we perceive the situation as normal. That is scary. Know your worth. That's how Mr. Wrong has to exit, because now I know my worth. I'm worthy. I am a queen. I do need to be honored. I do need to be respected. I do need to be loved. When I can go into a mirror and that's who I see, I'm a queen, and I will not settle for anything less than a king. When we have that type of mindset, you'll be amazed in terms of the men who you will filter out, you will not give your time to, because you understand that they mean you no good. So you have to know your worth. If you don't know your worth, Mr. Wrong will stay with you indefinitely. Recognize that you are the prize. You're the prize. We get stuck in unhealthy relationships because we think the other person is the prize. How about that? We stay because we think Mr. Wrong is the prize. Girl, I can't let go of him. He's a good man. He's a good man. But I hear how he speaks to you. I see how he treats you. And somehow you've built this bubble that says he's a good man. He's the prize, and I can't let him go. But if you flip that and you recognize this is not a person who's good for me mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and sometimes even physically, this man is not good for me. And guess what? No, he is not the prize. So exit left, Mr. Wrong. It's time to go. What's our next slide? Preparing for Mr. Right. First of all, let me preface this, because I don't want you to feel like I'm asking you to wait on a man, because that is not a true statement. I'm not asking you to wait on a man. And when I say preparing for Mr. Right, I don't want you to take that out of context, because I don't want you to think I'm saying do all these things for the purpose of getting a good man. And the reason why I'm not saying that is here's the reality. Whatever we do to improve ourselves has to be first and foremost for ourselves. If I lose weight, I don't need to be losing weight because I want to draw a different type of man. I need to be losing weight for me. If I want to further my education, I don't need to be furthering my education for a certain man to show up. I need to be furthering my education for me. Whatever changes I make internally, externally, I have to make sure that first and foremost, those changes are about me. So when I say preparing for Mr. Right, I don't want you to misconstrue that and think that I'm telling you, okay, if you do all of these things, then Mr. Right is going to show up. No, if you do the things that you know are needful for you to be your best version, for you to be happy within yourself, then yes, it's a very good chance that's what you're going to draw. But at the end of the day, it's really about you and what you need and what fulfills you and what satisfies you and what makes you feel like you are living your best life in a better version. But in preparing, we relinquish the idea of loss. And I pretty much touched on that. You know, we think it's a loss. If Mr. Wrong leaves the relationship, we feel like there was a loss. You know how we made the comment, you know, sometimes you got to cut your losses. Well, there was never a gain. Mr. Wrong was never a gain. So if Mr. Wrong was never a gain, then there's no loss. But I have to relinquish the idea. I got to relinquish the idea that I lost something and recognize, if I go back to that comment of me being the prize, if I'm committed to that reality that I was the prize and that relationship terminates and he leaves, then there was no loss. So I relinquish that idea that there's a loss. I affirm myself. We don't do enough of that. We don't affirm who we are. We don't do it enough. We need to be able to be in a mirror and see the beauty, and not just the physical beauty, but acknowledge who we are internally. Acknowledge that we're good, we're worthy, that we have value. You know, see the beauty in who we are. We're smart, we're innovative, we're creative, we're good parents. You know, we're a good person. Affirm yourself. Understand the benefit. What do you mean? Understand the benefit of that relationship ending. Understand that was a benefit. Don't be bamboozled. It was not a bad thing. When Mr. Wrong leaves, whether he leaves on his own or whether you ask him to leave, it is a benefit. It is your moment. It is your moment to shed those layers, to understand who you are. It's a moment for you to reinvent yourself. It's a moment to push yourself through those dark places of feeling less than. It's a moment for you to understand that what happened in terms of the relationship ending is probably the best thing that could have happened for you. What's the next thing? Value time. Even though I'm not in a relationship, I value my time. I use my time for me. I use my time to get better. I use my time to get acquainted with me. There comes a point that you have to be good with yourself all by yourself. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I think we fail to recognize or to even appreciate that if you're single, it's by choice, not by chance. You're not by yourself because you're not a good person, you're not attractive, you're overweight, you're not smart, you're not. It has nothing to do with it. When you know who you are, when you know your worth, when you understand the life that you live and how you live it, you value that time. What's next? Live your life unapologetically. Now, this is not about if you do wrong, live your life unapologetically. But what I'm talking about, when I say live your life unapologetically, when Mr. Wrong has gotten into your head, has gotten into your space, and you have allowed him to devalue who you are, degrade who you are, tell you who you are, tell you who you're not, you have to learn how to live your life unapologetically. You have to relinquish all that negativity. Stop apologizing for who you are. Stop apologizing for your life. Rather than to spend it in apologies, spend it in becoming your best version. Not necessarily based on what Mr. Wrong has told you, but based on who you want to be, based on how you feel you need to improve yourself, based on how you want to feel about yourself. But don't ever let anyone, or in this situation, don't allow Mr. Wrong to position you to feel apologetic for who you are. I have heard horrible things been said. I've heard men say horrible things. Nobody wants you. You should be glad I'm with you. You're overweight. You need to lose weight. You're really not that attractive. And if we stay around long enough in those type of environments, those kind of relationships, we will begin to believe the story. But I'm asking you to live your life unapologetically. And if you're in a situation with Mr. Wrong, it's time to make a change. Change the narrative, change your perspective, change your perception. I don't know who your Mr. Wrong is. You may feel like there is no Mr. Wrong that currently exists in your life. But for all I know, you may have woke up with Mr. Wrong this morning. When you turned over, that may have been Mr. Wrong. Mr. Wrong may have been the person you talked to last night. Mr. Wrong may be the person you're going to go out with this evening. Mr. Wrong may be the person who's standing afar off, just waiting for the opportunity. I don't know who your Mr. Wrong is, but I've tried to spend some time with you today to let you know that he does exist. But aside from knowing that he exists, I think the greater picture becomes holding yourself accountable for those things that you give yourself permission for other people to do, the things that you allow Mr. Wrong to do, the fact that you even allow him to get in your space. Because like I said, once we realize who he is in terms of behavior, in terms of the way he speaks to us, once we acknowledge that, we're better equipped that when he shows up, we know how to give him the to the left. You got to exit. I don't have time. My time is precious. My time is valuable. And I want to invest my time. I don't want to mismanage my time by contending with a man who means me no good. And as I said, if we strengthen our sisterhood and we share this with one another and we nurture one another, we make it more and more difficult for a Mr. Wrong to show up. And not only do we make it more difficult for him to show up, we surely make it difficult for him to stay. Because as we learn and believe and feed the reality that we are queens, that we should be honored, that we should be respected, we should be loved, we should be treated right. If we really believe that, Mr. Wrong will not have a chance to thrive or survive in a space with you, because now you know the telltale signs, now you know what to do. And it's really, like I said, about spending time with yourself and understanding your self-worth. If you leave here with nothing else today, I want you to leave with the reality that you are a queen. You really are. And if you're in an unhealthy relationship with a Mr. Wrong, I want you to understand that you deserve so much more. Don't undersell yourself. You deserve so much more. I'm going to stop right there. I know we've had you on mute. Some of you may have had a thought. Some of you may have a question. If you did, you can send that through the chat. We will respond to that before we close. If you don't have a thought, if you don't have a question, that's okay as well. What I will tell you is that if you think of something and you want to shoot it over to the email address that's on the screen, you can do that. You can catch up with me on my podcast every Sunday, The Room Where It Happens. You can go out to the website. There are books out there for you to enjoy if you don't already have them. But what I will do before we tie this down to the very end, I am going to leave you with the poem, Letting Go of Mr. Wrong and Preparing for Mr. Right. So I had intended to do that at the beginning, but I will go ahead and do that for you now. It says, let me say this with all the love I have in me. It's time to let go of Mr. Wrong. Girl, set yourself free. You are a queen who doesn't know her worth and has settled for a man you cannot convert. Robbing yourself of a king who is closer than you know. Stop investing your time in a man who needs to go. You have wonderful qualities and ability to stand on your own. But part of the problem is you're concerned of being alone, afraid that you will be defined by not having a man, So you are attempting to be content with half of a man. Trust me when I say you are the prize. So look in the mirror and give a high five. You are strong enough and have the courage to let go. Because with Mr. Wrong, girl, you will never grow. Your spirit will always long for something more. Yes, my sister, it is time to show Mr. Wrong the door. Value who you are and what you can become, preparing yourself for Mr. Right, that special someone. I am not saying to live your life waiting on a man, but do all that you can do to be the best you can. When you have confidence in who you are, Mr. Right will take notice that he is looking at a star. I leave you with that, and I hope that that encourages you. I think we might have one either comment or question down here in the chat. Let me see before I leave you. No, we don't. Okay, well, like I said, we're going to be doing this for the next 3 weeks. Next week, we're going to talk about the me before the we, and that really is going to be a lot about self assessment, self evaluation, unpacking our emotional baggage, not living in the past, just a real peeling of layers for us to become healthier in our own spirit, to see ourselves in a better light, and recognizing the value in just continuing to work on self. Because as I said in the beginning, we can't control other people, but we can definitely control ourselves and we can make changes for ourselves. So I hope you all have enjoyed this. I hope you will return next week. And maybe next week we'll get some questions and comments. But until then, be strong enough to be courageous in the truth. And thank you for showing up.